Elijah Washington's worn calculus textbook, dog-eared and highlighted with 3 different colors, lay open on his desk as students filed into Princeton's Richardson Auditorium. His fingers traced the edges of a theorem he'd memorized years ago, heart hammering against his ribs. After 2 years at Essex County Community College, working nights at a convenience store while caring for his grandmother, this transfer scholarship represented everything he'd sacrificed for. The whispers and sidelong glances from students in designer clothes didn't escape his notice, but he kept his eyes forward, shoulders straight. Before I go on, I would really appreciate it if you give this video a like, click the subscribe button down below. It would really encourage me to create more videos for you. Thank you so much. Alright, let's continue. Professor Richard Harmon swept into the lecture hall precisely at 9 a.m., his tailored blazer and silver-streaked hair projecting an air of academic royalty. The room fell silent as he surveyed his new crop of students with piercing blue eyes that seemed to evaluate and dismiss in the same glance. "Welcome to Advanced Multivariable Calculus," he announced, voice crisp as autumn air. "Many of you won't make it to midterms. Some of you," his gaze lingered pointedly on Elijah, "perhaps shouldn't be here at all." Roll call proceeded alphabetically, with Harmon offering small comments for students he recognized, a nod for Abernathy legacy admission, a smile for Chun, National Math Olympiad finalist. When he reached Washington Elijah, his eyebrow arched. "Ah, our transfer student from Essex County Community College, is it? How interesting." The word dripped with skepticism as scattered chuckles rippled through the hall. "Since you've chosen to join our prestigious program, Mr. Washington," Harmon continued, setting down his attendance sheet with deliberate slowness, "perhaps you'd care to demonstrate the preparedness of your previous institution?" He gestured toward the whiteboard, where a complex partial differential equation appeared on the projector. "Solve this, if you would." Elijah felt 40 pairs of eyes boring into his back as he approached the board, marker trembling slightly in his hand. The equation was far beyond first-day material, clearly selected to humiliate. What Professor Harmon couldn't know was that Elijah had been solving equations like this since he was 12, when a kind librarian had noticed him reading calculus books meant for college students and had connected him with online resources and advanced materials. Under the pseudonym E.J. Mathis, Elijah had already published 2 papers in respected mathematics journals, work he'd completed between shifts at the store and visits to his grandmother's doctors. The equation on the board was challenging but familiar, similar to one he'd tackled in his second paper on dynamical systems. Elijah's mind raced as he lifted the marker. If he solved this perfectly, Harmon would only escalate his targeting. He made a split-second decision, working through the problem with methodical precision, but deliberately inserting a subtle error in the final step, noticeable to an expert, but defensible as a reasonable mistake. "I believe that's the solution, Professor," Elijah said quietly, capping the marker and turning to face the class. Some students looked bored, others confused, a few impressed despite themselves. Harmon's lips curled into a triumphant smile as he approached the board. "Almost, Mr. Washington, but not quite. You've made an error in the final integration." He circled Elijah's deliberate mistake with a red marker. "Perhaps at Essex County this would earn a passing grade, but at Princeton we expect perfection." The professor turned to address the class. "Let this be a lesson to all of you about the importance of fundamentals." As Elijah returned to his seat, he caught the eye of a young woman, Sophie Chin according to roll call, who gave him a small nod of what seemed like respect. For the remainder of the lecture, Harmon ignored Elijah, focusing instead on students from backgrounds similar to his own. Elijah took meticulous notes while his mind worked on something else entirely: how to navigate this battlefield of privilege and prejudice without sacrificing his future. When class ended, Elijah packed his worn textbook with careful hands. "Just the first battle," he whispered to himself, "not the war." Behind him, unnoticed, Sophie Chin lingered, watching with curious eyes as the underestimated transfer student quietly slipped away. 2 weeks into the semester, Elijah's notebook contained 2 sets of solutions for every problem: the ones he submitted to Professor Harmon and the elegant, more sophisticated approaches he kept to himself. Each returned assignment came back with the same red marks, the same condescending comments: adequate, uninspired, lacks Princeton-level insight. Yet Elijah noticed that students who used identical methods but had the right pedigrees received praise for their solid fundamentals. The West Campus Library became Elijah's sanctuary, its towering stacks and quiet corners offering refuge from Harmon's classroom battlefield. Late one evening, as golden lamplight pooled on ancient oak tables, Elijah noticed 3 classmates huddled over problem sets, frustration etched on their faces. After a moment's hesitation, he approached them. "That integration by parts needs a substitution first," he suggested quietly, pointing to the equation Sophie-chan was struggling with. Her startled expression melted into relief as Elijah walked them through the solution, explaining each step with a clarity their professor never bothered to provide. "You actually understand this stuff," remarked Tyrell, an engineering student. "Harmon makes it seem like advanced calculus is some exclusive club we're not smart enough to join." What began as a one-time help session evolved into regular study groups, with Elijah patiently unraveling Harmon's deliberately obscure problem sets for a growing circle of grateful classmates. He was careful to stay under the radar, declining when they suggested he should challenge Harmon's assessments of his work. Meanwhile, Professor Harmon's latest research paper, Novel Approaches to Chaotic Systems and Differential Equations, sat open on Elijah's screen at 2 a.m., his eyes narrowing at a critical section where the mathematics didn't flow correctly. The error wasn't obvious, a misapplication of a theorem that led to conclusions that seemed plausible but were fundamentally flawed. Elijah recognized it because he'd made the same mistake years ago before developing his own correction. If published without revision, the paper would eventually be discredited, potentially damaging Harmon's bid for department chair that everyone whispered about. In class the next day, Harmon announced the midterm would account for 40% of their final grade. "Some of you," his gaze lingered pointedly on Elijah, "might consider whether this course exceeds your preparation." The message was clear. Harmon was creating an opportunity to force Elijah out. That afternoon, Sophie caught up with Elijah outside the mathematics building, rain soaking into both their backpacks. "He's doing this on purpose," she said bluntly. "My father sits on university boards. I've seen this before. Men like Harmon can't stand talent that doesn't come in packages they recognize." The night before the midterm, Elijah received an email from the Journal of Mathematical Analysis and Applications. They were publishing his latest paper, submitted under his pseudonym E.J. Mathis. The contrast was dizzying. In one world, he was a pioneer making meaningful contributions to mathematical theory. In another, he was presumed incompetent based solely on where he'd started his education. When the midterm arrived, Harmon's smug expression suggested he believed he'd crafted problems beyond his target's capabilities. Elijah felt a familiar calm settle over him as he read through the exam. The final problem, worth 30% of the total, was designed to seem straightforward, but contained a trap that would lead most students to pages of fruitless calculations. Elijah recognized an opportunity hidden within the challenge. For 4 hours, Elijah worked methodically, saving the final problem for last. When he reached it, instead of following the obvious approach, he transformed the equation using a technique he'd developed for his latest paper, converting what seemed like an integration nightmare into an elegant solution that required just half a page. He knew it was a risk exposing this level of insight, but something in him had reached a breaking point. 2 days later, Professor Harmon strode into class, midterms in hand. "Most of you performed as expected," he announced coldly. Mr. Washington, however, elected to use what I can only describe as community college creativity on the final problem. He projected Elijah's solution on the screen, voice dripping with scorn, until a murmur swept through the class as students with stronger backgrounds recognized the brilliance of the approach. "This technique," Harmon continued, faltering slightly, while unorthodox, did arrive at the correct answer. For the first time, Elijah saw uncertainty flash across the professor's face as he quickly moved on, but not before Sophie shot Elijah a knowing smile from across the room. The Princeton Mathematics Department's bulletin board displayed the latest issue of the Journal of Mathematical Analysis and Applications, featuring a groundbreaking paper on chaotic systems that solved the Nakamura conjecture, a problem that had stumped mathematicians for decades. Students gathered around, whispering about the mysterious E.J. Mathis who had seemingly emerged from nowhere to make such a significant contribution. Elijah walked past, backpack slung over one shoulder, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth as he overheard snippets of off-field conversation about his work. "A remarkable achievement," Professor Harmon declared in class that afternoon, holding up the journal. "I've been in correspondence with Mathis myself." The blatant lie stung Elijah more than the man's previous slights. "This," Harmon continued, tapping the journal cover, "is the caliber of thinking that distinguishes truly elite mathematicians from those who merely follow formulas." Several students glanced uncomfortably toward Elijah, now recognized for his midterm brilliance despite Harmon's attempts to diminish it. The professor announced their final project: develop an original approach to a contemporary mathematical problem, worth 50% of their grade. Later that week, Elijah discovered a printout of his published paper on a table in the advanced mathematics lab, covered in Harmon's distinctive red annotations. The man was incorporating Elijah's techniques into his own flawed paper without attribution, while simultaneously preparing to judge whether Elijah's final project met Princeton standards. The irony might have been amusing if Elijah's entire future didn't hang in the balance. His scholarship renewal depended on maintaining exemplary grades in all classes. That night, Sophie found Elijah buried in calculations in the library's far corner. "You're pushing yourself too hard," she observed, sliding into the chair opposite him. When Elijah didn't respond, she tapped her finger on the open journal beside his laptop. "Your work, isn't it? E.J. Mathis." His head snapped up, eyes wide with alarm. "Don't worry," she continued softly. "I've worked with enough brilliant people in math competitions to recognize patterns in thinking. Your midterm solution used the same approach as this paper. Question is, why are you hiding?" "How could I not?" Elijah finally replied, voice barely above a whisper. "From the moment I walked into that classroom, Harmon decided what I was capable of. If I'd shown everything I know." He trailed off, the weight of a lifetime navigating spaces that weren't designed for him evident in the slump of his shoulders. Sophie nodded slowly, understanding dawning in her eyes. For the first time, Elijah shared his full story: the childhood fascination with numbers, the pseudonym created after a math forum dismissed his work when they learned he was a 15-year-old black kid from Newark, the years of working double shifts to support his grandmother while publishing papers that were changing his field. 2 days before the final project deadline, Professor Harmon announced he would be presenting his research at the department's year-end symposium, research that Elijah now knew contained critical errors patched with unattributed adaptations of his own work. "Your final projects will be evaluated immediately following my presentation," Harmon added with a self-satisfied smile. "I expect most of you will benefit from seeing how a proper mathematical argument is structured." That evening, Elijah sat alone in his dorm room, staring at 2 documents on his laptop screen: his near-complete final project on an entirely different topic, and a comprehensive analysis revealing the flaws in Harmon's research alongside elegant corrections that would actually make the professor's central thesis viable. Sophie's parting words from their conversation echoed in his mind: "Hiding your light doesn't protect you. It just gives power to people who don't deserve it." With steady hands, Elijah deleted his original project and began crafting a new one, a paper that would serve as both revelation and revolution. He worked through the night, fueled by a lifetime of having to prove himself within systems designed to exclude him. As dawn broke over Princeton's Gothic spires, Elijah added the finishing touch to his title page: authored by Elijah Washington, E.J. Mathis, a simple declaration that would upend everything. The morning of the submission deadline, Elijah printed his paper and held it for a long moment before placing it in a folder. This wasn't just about exposing Harmon or claiming recognition. It was about refusing to participate in his own erasure any longer. With a deep breath, Elijah walked across campus to submit his final project and claim his true place in the world of mathematics, the weight of pretense finally lifting from his shoulders as each step brought him closer to a reckoning that could no longer be postponed. Richardson Hall's main auditorium buzzed with anticipation. Faculty members in academic regalia mingled with graduate students and undergraduates fortunate enough to secure seats for the department's prestigious year-end symposium. Professor Harmon stood near the podium, accepting premature congratulations from colleagues on his soon-to-be presented research. Elijah slipped into a seat in the back row, his final project, now submitted to both Professor Harmon and Department Chair Dr. Eleanor Wilson, weighing on his mind like a live grenade with its pin removed. Dr. Wilson tapped her microphone, calling the symposium to order. "Before we begin today's presentations, I have an unexpected but delightful announcement. It appears we have mathematical royalty among us." She held up the latest issue of the Journal of Mathematical Analysis. The author who solved the Nakamura conjecture, E.J. Mathis, is none other than our own transfer student, Elijah Washington. A shocked murmur rippled through the audience as all heads turned toward Elijah. The journal editor confirmed this just this morning. Mr. Washington's paper represents one of the most significant undergraduate contributions to mathematics in Princeton's recent history. Professor Harmon's face drained of color as he stared at Elijah with dawning horror. Across the room, Sophie Chin wore a satisfied smile. Dr. Wilson continued, "I've just had the opportunity to review Mr. Washington's final project for Professor Harmon's class, a remarkable analysis that actually addresses some questions in Professor Harmon's own research." She gestured to Harmon. "I'm sure you'll want to acknowledge this during your presentation, Richard. Before I go on, I would really appreciate it if you give this video a like, click the subscribe button down below. It would really encourage me to create more videos for you. Thank you so much. Alright, let's continue." Harmon approached Elijah during the brief intermission before his presentation, cornering him near the water fountain outside the auditorium. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he hissed, face contorted with anger. "I'll fail your project for academic sabotage. Undermining a professor's research is grounds for disciplinary action." His fingers dug into Elijah's arm, voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "No one will believe some community college transfer over a tenured Princeton professor. Know your place." What neither man realized was that Sophie stood just around the corner, recording the exchange on her phone while Professor Amara Okafor from the Ethics Committee watched with narrowed eyes. Sophie gave Professor Okafor a solemn nod before they both slipped away, leaving Harmon to return to the auditorium, believing his threat had landed unopposed. Harmon's presentation began smoothly, his confidence returning as he walked the audience through the elegant mathematics of chaotic systems. Elijah watched in silence, noting each moment when Harmon presented ideas lifted directly from E.J. Mathis's papers, his papers, without attribution. When Harmon reached the critical section containing the error Elijah had identified, he glossed over it with practiced academic jargon, obscuring the logical gap with verbal sleight of hand. "I believe there's a question from the back," Dr. Wilson interrupted, gesturing toward where Professor Okafor sat with her hand raised. The question was precise, surgical, targeting exactly the flaw in Harmon's reasoning that Elijah had corrected in his final project. Harmon faltered, attempting to redirect, but Professor Okafor persisted. "Perhaps," she suggested with pointed courtesy, "our resident expert on the Nakamura conjecture might offer some insight, given that his final project addresses this exact issue." All eyes turned to Elijah. The moment stretched like an infinite series as he stood, feeling the weight of every privilege and disadvantage that had led to this crossroads. "Professor Harmon's approach is innovative," he began diplomatically, "but there's a misapplication of the divergence theorem in the third step." With methodical precision, Elijah walked through the error, his voice gaining strength with each equation he wrote on the whiteboard. "However, if we apply the correction method I developed in my work on the Nakamura conjecture, the proof becomes viable, and actually extends the application in fascinating ways." The auditorium fell silent as Elijah finished his explanation. Professor Harmon stood frozen at the podium, his academic reputation unraveling before his eyes. It was Dr. Wilson who broke the silence, her slow applause quickly joined by others until the room thundered with recognition. "Brilliant," she declared, approaching Elijah. "Simply brilliant." As the audience rose in standing ovation, Elijah caught sight of Professor Harmon slipping out a side door, his presentation notes abandoned on the podium like the remnants of a crumbling empire. The mathematics department conference room had never felt so crowded. Elijah sat at one end of the polished oak table, Sophie beside him for moral support, while a somber collection of faculty members occupied the remaining seats. At the head of the table, Dr. Wilson placed a folder on the table with deliberate care. "The evidence is troubling," she began. "Professor Harmon's conduct appears to be part of a pattern." She slid forward several documents, grade distributions showing statistically significant disparities in how Harmon evaluated students from different backgrounds, testimony from former teaching assistants, and Sophie's recording of his threat against Elijah. "This isn't just about one brilliant student Professor Harmon misjudged," Professor Okafor added, her voice carrying the weight of the ethics committee she chaired. "Our review of past courses shows consistent discrimination against first-generation college students, transfers, and minorities, particularly in subjective grading areas." The data projected onto the screen told a damning story. Years of academically qualified students pushed out of mathematics by evaluation standards that shifted depending on who was being evaluated. Professor Harmon had been offered the chance to attend, but had instead submitted a written statement claiming Elijah had deliberately undermined him out of vengeance for being held to proper academic standards. The statement rang hollow against the evidence. Dr. Wilson turned to Elijah, whose life had been upended in the week since the symposium. News of the community college prodigy writing as E.J. Mathis had spread beyond Princeton, resulting in interview requests and even preliminary discussions about fellowship opportunities he'd never imagined possible. "Mr. Washington, the department owes you an apology. More importantly, we need your perspective on how to address this systemically." Elijah looked around the table at faces now regarding him with respect rather than suspicion. The validation felt bittersweet, recognition that should have been his from the beginning now granted only after extraordinary proof. "When I was 12, he began quietly, I encountered a quote from Ramanujan about how an equation has no meaning unless it expresses a thought of God. Mathematics was my sanctuary, a place where truth couldn't be determined by prejudice." He gestured toward the evidence of Harmon's discrimination. But systems built by people always reflect their biases, even in fields supposedly based on objective truth. Rather than dwelling on punishment for Harmon, Elijah proposed a department-wide initiative: anonymous grading of exams, mentorship programs pairing underrepresented students with supportive faculty, and regular statistical reviews of grade distributions to identify patterns of bias. "The goal isn't retribution," he concluded. "It's correction, just like in mathematics. When we find an error, we don't just highlight it. We rebuild the proof to make it stronger." 3 weeks later, Professor Harmon sat before the university disciplinary committee. His tenure protected him from outright dismissal, but not from consequences. The committee's decision came swiftly: reassignment to teaching introductory courses under supervision, mandatory training on inclusive teaching practices, and removal from consideration for department chair. His research would require independent verification before university submission, a professional humiliation that struck at the heart of his academic identity. On the last day of the semester, Elijah received an unexpected visitor in his dorm room: Dr. James Chun, Sophie's father and a trustee of the university. "I've been following your story with interest," he said, extending his hand. "The Chun Foundation would like to establish a full scholarship in applied mathematics for community college transfers. We'd like you to help design the selection criteria." The offer represented exactly what Elijah had hoped for: not just personal success, but structural change. By the following autumn, Elijah Washington's name appeared on the faculty listing as an undergraduate teaching assistant for advanced calculus, the same course where Harmon had tried to humiliate him. The classroom felt different now, sunlight streaming through leaded glass windows onto faces representing a broader spectrum of backgrounds than Princeton's mathematics department had seen in years. These students were the first beneficiaries of the new inclusivity initiatives that had grown from the controversy. "The beauty of mathematics," Elijah told his students on their first day, "is that brilliance doesn't care where you started or what others assume about your capabilities." As his students opened their textbooks, Elijah noticed a familiar figure passing by the classroom: Professor Harmon, carrying materials for his remedial algebra course down the hall. Their eyes met briefly through the doorway. Elijah gave a small, acknowledging nod before turning back to his students, the future of mathematics waiting for his guidance.